Hi, and welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo. The battleground for animal rights has evolved from laboratories to corporate boardrooms, but in the future, it will likely be increasingly waged in the courtroom. And it's the reason PETA has assembled one of the largest nonprofit legal teams in the country to advocate for animals over the basic questions like, what rights do animals really have? Do they have standing to sue anybody? And what about the owners, or rather the companions of the animals? What rights do they have over the animals? On this episode of the PETA Podcast, we reprise our second episode ever, where PETA General Counsel Jeff Kerr talked to me about how animal rights will be dictated by legal decisions, where the fight for the animals will essentially be the next frontier of civil rights in this country. When we spoke in 2018, Kerr talked about the now infamous monkey Selfie-Case involving Naruto, the macaque, who claimed ownership of a picture because it was his monkey fingers that pressed the camera shutter. Kerr also talked about the other litigation that questions whether an animal has constitutional rights. They're the cases defining the modern fight for animal rights. That's all next on this special reprise of the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, and thanks again for joining us for another behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and why they stay motivated to make the world cruelty-free. In episode 1, we talked to PETA president and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk. And you may have heard her clarify her statement, the one where she says a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. Check it out. She also talks about the cruelty of so-called no-kill shelters and how she became destined to be a founder of PETA when, as a young girl, she had a deep relationship with her dog, Shawnee. Now for this episode. Have you heard about Naruto, the macaque who took the so-called monkey selfie? Everyone's heard about that. In this program, I talked to the person behind PETA's Person of the Year and how he filed a first-of-its-kind lawsuit to win the copyrights to the famous monkey selfie picture for the monkey himself. I talked to PETA General Counsel Jeffrey Kerr about this, about animal rights in the courtroom, and how animal rights is much more connected to the broader civil rights struggle. That's on this episode of the PETA Podcast. Jeff Kerr, thank you for being here with us. You are PETA's top lawyer, the chief. Now, a lot of people don't know that PETA has this large legal department. Tell us about it.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, Emil. We have the largest legal department of any animal rights group in the world, and we've been very successful over the years to have achieved the most precedents for animals of any law group. And it's been built over the last 25 years, and it's a privilege to lead the department.
You said the phrase precedent-setting cases, and I don't think people realize that at all, how huge these cases are. Like, for example, Naruto, named PETA's Person of the Year. This is the monkey selfie case. Talk about that a little bit, because, when you talk about Naruto and the idea of, well, can an animal own the rights to his own photo? I mean, then you're really getting to the core of what animal rights and, what this movement is all about, don't you, when you talk about Naruto?
Sure. And what the vast majority of our legal work entails is cases like the monkey selfie case on behalf of Naruto. It's about trying to enforce, expand, or establish fundamental rights for animals in their own right, not in relation to how they can be exploited by humans. And Naruto's case is a perfect example. He picked up a photographer's unattended camera in 2011 and made the connection between him pushing the shutter, the sound that made, and his change to his reflection in the camera lens. And he proceeded to make a series of faces while continually pressing the shutter to see that change in his reflection, and it resulted in the famous monkey selfie photograph. And as you mentioned, we filed a lawsuit on his behalf, arguing for the first time in history that a non-human animal should be the owner of the copyright to those photographs, just like any other photographer would be entitled to the copyright. And Naruto shouldn't be treated any differently simply because he doesn't happen to be a human.
No, wait a minute, Jeff. You're now. This is the skeptic in me, and I'm sure that there are some skeptics out there who would say, "Hey, this is an animal. He doesn't own anything. He may have pressed his finger on the shutter, but does that mean he's the owner of that picture? I mean, that's really what you're asking the court to decide on."
That's exactly right. And the answer is yes, he should be the owner. The law is very clear. Copyright law is very clear that the copyright belongs to he who creates the work. And in this case, there's no question, but Naruto created the work. He made independent creative decisions when he took the picture. He decided to pick up the camera. He figured out how to push the shutter. He understood the cause and effect between the shutter release and the sound of the shutter opening and closing, resulting in the change in his reflection. And he proceeded to take those photographs. And under any other circumstances, if that was a human who had done that, there'd be no question but that the creator would be entitled to the copyright. And the same should hold true for Naruto.
So it goes right to the issue of why are we so speciesist, right? I mean, it really goes right to that issue directly.
That's exactly right. And our whole fundamental point and perspective is that we have to break through that species barrier when we're talking about how to properly engage with animals, and most importantly, to recognize that they have and should be recognized to have fundamental rights in their own right. Right now, we have a series of animal exploitation laws. I say that because the laws generally are designed to allow a certain level of harm or exploitation to be perpetrated against animals by humans. That's changing in part because of our work, but certainly not fast enough, and that's what we're really about.
Well, back to the Selfie-Case. When you first raised it, there were a lot of people who said, this is ridiculous, and they wanted to throw it out, but this case did not get thrown out.
Well, we did lose the lower court decision. And of course there were opponents, but that's no different than any other social justice movement. And it's important to keep in mind that that's exactly what this is. Animal rights is the next frontier of civil rights. And whether you're talking about the anti-slavery movement or movements to obtain suffrage for women or children or for the LGBTQ community, every one of those social justice causes has encountered opposition, has encountered ridicule. But inexorably, those movements have won and are continuing to win. The job's never done, but we're certainly seeing movement where the animals are winning. And I'm very fond of a quote that my mentor in the law, noted civil rights lawyer Phil Hirschkopf, said to me when we had been finished with another case that we may talk about involving the 13th Amendment. He said, in civil rights cases, you lose, you lose, you lose, and then you win. And so we are not in the least deterred if we don't win a particular case. It's about starting to lay the groundwork so that the road to fundamental rights for animals can start to be paved.
Well, let's finish off with Naruto by saying what happened in the case. You lost in the lower court, but there was a settlement, so there was a kind of a happier ending than just a legal defeat. Tell me the disposition and where is Naruto now? Is he off in a corner looking at making more selfies, and does he own his pictures? What's happening?
Well, Naruto is alive and well on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, where he and his community of macaques lives. They're critically endangered, and they desperately need help. And we were very pleased in that regard because after we argued the appeal of the case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, we were able to come to a settlement with the photographer who was claiming the copyright in the photographs. And he agreed as part of the settlement that going forward, he would donate 25% of his gross receipts from the sale or licensing of the monkey selfie photographs to be donated specifically to charities whose purpose and mission it is to benefit Naruto, the macaques, and protect their habitat. There was no finding as to who owns the copyright. We still believe that Naruto should be entitled to it. But as of this time, nobody owns the copyright, and the photograph is available for people to use.
So who owns Naruto? Is that at issue? I mean, would the copyright be owned by the person who says that Naruto is his property, or are we in a new realm where Naruto is free? He's not owned by anyone, because that's a big question that would seem to be a factor in, who owns the copyright.
Naruto, you're right. Naruto is a free living macaque. And so what we argued is that he should own the copyright. And then PETA offered, if the court would allow it, to administer the copyright for him, license it, and utilize it in a way that revenue could be derived from it, with 100%, every penny of that revenue going to help Naruto and his community of macaques. And that's no different than a circumstance in which if you had a mentally disabled human adult or a minor child who can't take care of their own affairs. We stood in what would be known as the next friend status in the law of Naruto, and argued on his behalf for the protection of his rights. And that is a very common, widely used concept in the law.
Boy, if you had won this, or it looks like you're building up to maybe a victory at some point, who knows when, 10, 20, 30 years. But I mean, that would change everything if animals were seen as independent without any owners, because if one had an owner, then that would almost be like slavery, right? And
well, we prefer the term companion. Certainly with the animals that we share our lives with, for people who really care for them, any of them would tell you that these animals are their companions. And that's really what we want to continue on with. No question that humans have domesticated animals so that in many instances they are dependent upon us for their protection, their food, their care. But that is a relationship that should not be exploited in our view. Rather, the animals should be treated in a way that's respective of and giving of fundamental rights and needs to them in their own right, rather than being treated as beings simply that we can use or exploit for our own benefit.
We were talking about slavery, and that lawsuit involved SeaWorld. And talk about this case, because this seems to me, once again, PETA's legal team going right to the heart of, why animal rights is so important. Tell us about the origin of the case and its status now.
Well, the case originates from the text of the 13th Amendment, and that does not use the term person or human. In fact, it simply prohibits the existence of slavery anywhere in the United States. And our argument quite simply was that by any definition of that term, Tilikum and the other wild captured orcas imprisoned at SeaWorld are enslaved. And so we believe that if they are subject to enslavement, they should be entitled to the protection from that enslavement under the amendment, just like anybody else in the United States should be. Again, this case got at the heart of our hypocrisy in recognizing fundamental rights for humans, but denying those same fundamental rights to animals of other species simply because they're not human.
How was it received by legal scholars? How was it received by the court? Because on its face, if you don't know about the 13th Amendment and you aren't willing to argue, well, the 13th Amendment doesn't say specifically human, how do you make the leap that, oh, well, it applies to animals? And what kind of skepticism did you see?
Well, there was some skepticism and opposition, of course, but there was also a great amount of interest in the legal community, and there still is, because this is about pushing the boundaries. It's about, just like we've done in constitutional thought and application throughout the history of our country. There are many instances in which provisions of the Constitution, the language itself has not changed, but rights have continued to expand and be extended to groups previously thought not to be covered by that language. And this was the latest example of it. But again, we aren't put off by people who may express opposition, who may argue with us. We want that discussion because that discussion leads to exposing the hypocrisy of our laws and how we deny these fundamental rights to animals that we claim for ourselves. And there's no justifiable reason for that difference.
How about the civil rights community? Do you see much alliance being formed between those who would advocate for civil rights for people of color, minorities, and who see that that they're kind of in the same boat as the animals, or do some people just look at that and say, are maybe they show that it trivializes civil rights when you compare a human to an animal?
Yeah, well, this is, as I said, the next frontier of civil rights. And there are a lot of thinkers in the civil rights community, foremost among them the person I mentioned earlier, Phil Hirschkopf, who argued and won the Loving versus Virginia decision before the Supreme Court back in the late 60s that declared unconstitutional laws prohibiting interracial marriage. He sat right next to me at the council table when I argued the 13th Amendment case. And we got a great reception from the federal court in San Diego where we argued it. And the court even complimented us on the quality of our briefing. These are cutting edge legal arguments that go to the heart of our relationship to other species that we interact with on a daily basis. And our position is always going to be arguing for the animals from their position.
Well, PETA and the co-plaintiffs ultimately lost. Do you think, despite that, it was still worth the effort?
Unquestionably, it's worth the effort. Again, you're not always going to win these cases when you're trying to break new ground. And that's just a mantle we are willing to bear. And however difficult those cases may be, the conditions that the animals are in that we are trying to get them out of are far worse. So I don't care if I have a tough day in front of a federal judge. It's nothing compared to cows and chickens having their throats cut while they're still fully conscious on a slaughter line, or tigers and elephants being whipped and beaten to perform tricks in some tawdry circus, or the horrible experiments that are performed on mice and rats and rabbits and dogs and chimpanzees in laboratories around this country.
Well, in the big picture, what part do you think these lawsuits play in terms of furthering animal rights? I know that PETA does a lot of other things, the protests and the demonstrations, and the corporate involvement to try to push inside, shareholders, the consciences. Where do you think these lawsuits play in terms of ultimately winning the fight for animal rights?
I think these cases are critical to that because they're laying the groundwork, as I said, to the day when minds are going to change and the laws are going to change along with it. And so is our interpretation of the Constitution and regulations and every other aspect of the law. Just like in previous generations, our views of people of other races, ethnicities, religions, genders, sexual orientation, ages, you name it, have changed. And this is critical. It's a critical part of the whole of what PETA does in arguing for animals, exposing the abuse and exploitation that animals suffer and face daily everywhere, and changing the day, changing things for the day when they have fundamental rights recognized for them. This is an integral part of that journey.
We talked about these cases that even despite defeat, there's still some progress being made, as you say, through these use of these creative lawsuits. But you've had some victories too, and I just want to touch on one of the victories which has to do with the constitutionality or the unconstitutional use of these ag-gag laws, which were you try to prevent people from speaking out against the ag business interests here in our country. Talk about the ag-gag laws and where are we in terms of ag-gag throughout the nation right now at this point?
Well, the ag-gag laws were written by industry trade groups and put forward to a number of legislatures across the country. And all of these laws have in common the idea of trying to prevent people from videotaping or blowing the whistle on abject cruelty in slaughterhouses, laboratories, wherever animals are being abused and exploited. Instead of allowing scrutiny and shining a bright light on what goes on behind the closed doors of those places, they want to keep it hidden because they know that if people see the cruelty, as they do on PETA's YouTube page, where we get millions and millions of hits of our videos exposing animal abuse, that people are going to be outraged by it and they're going to demand change, and they don't want that attention. We've succeeded in getting ag-gag bills killed in 19 states. And in the states where they were passed, we're going after them one by one. And as you mentioned, we have had success in getting ag-gag laws declared unconstitutional in Idaho, in Utah, and we're fighting other cases as we speak.
The idea that people would go and make laws preventing factories from letting people know what they're doing behind closed doors, that just seems to me like not a good public relations move on the part of the factories. Instead of trying to change their practices, they say, well, it's none of your business until we actually deliver it to your dinner plate.
That's right. And it shows very clearly what they're about. They're only about profit. They don't care about the welfare of these animals. If they did, they would be installing video cameras.
So, Jeff, you're in a different part of the PETA fight, but a very important one. But I have to imagine that when you were in law school, you weren't necessarily thinking about fighting for the animals in this way, or am I wrong there? How did you come to this as your life calling?
Well, when I went to law school, I wanted to become a litigator, and that's what I focused my law school years on, was trying to become a civil litigator. And I was at the start of my career. And I found animal rights quite by happenstance when I went to attend a social justice lecture. And the person who was to give the lecture got caught in one of Washington, D.C.'s infamous Beltway traffic jams. And so his teaching assistant had to give the lecture that evening. And it just so happened that she was an animal rights activist. So the animal rights portion of the course, of the social justice course, was the only one she could give on the spur of the moment. The title of her lecture was, "Did Your Food Have a Face?" And it hit me right between the eyes. And I immediately realized that animal rights was something that touched me deeply, and started reading about it, threw all of the animal products out of my kitchen that night.
And the rest is history. Now we've gone over we've gone over some of the defeats that have ended up in sort of pushing the ball forward. Of all the cases that you've worked on, tell me about the most gratifying that has meant the most.
Well, I think that the monkey selfie case and the 13th Amendment cases are right up there for me as far as pushing the envelope to extend fundamental rights to animals for themselves. But certainly every victory we have, whether it's getting the first felony cruelty convictions for abusing pigs on factory farms, or for getting the first convictions under the federal anti-crush law that prohibits these sexual fetish videos where animals are stomped to death, and getting a 50-year sentence from the person who made those videos. My heart just sings every time we have a victory like that, and especially when the cases lead directly to the release or rescue of animals that are in bad situations. But I'd also have to say that probably the defeat of Ringling Brothers and them closing forever is right at the top of my list. For 146 years, they abused and exploited animals for their tawdry circus. And we fought them ever since PETA was founded in 1980. The legal department was a key part of that. We filed hundreds, literally hundreds of complaints to federal and state regulators about their conduct. We filed a complaint with the USDA that resulted in the largest fine in circus history against Ringling Brothers when we put together the evidence that they had baked a lion named Clyde to death in a boxcar in the Mojave Desert because they couldn't bother to stop to give him water. And one of their elephants broke both of his hind legs in a training accident when he was very young. And they beat an elephant who was chained named Angelica when they thought nobody was looking. It's now out of business for good.
And now also, since all of that has happened and since you began working at PETA, you can look back and this whole department of lawyers you lead is now really the example for animal rights law in the country.
Well, thank you. I sure hope so. We're at a point now, contrary to when I went to law school all those years ago, the lawyers who are working in our department went to law school specifically with the intention of studying and practicing for the improvement and recognition of fundamental rights for animals.
And where do you think the next steps are in terms of the legal frontier?
Well, getting animals the right to have what's called legal standing, to be able to sue on their behalf directly, in their own right, for their own protection, for their own interests. That is a critical issue right now, because as the laws stand now, there's still this perverse, hypocritical notion that only humans that suffer some kind of injury have the right to try to sue on behalf of animals who may be affected by the issues being complained of. And the real sea change in the law will take place when we finally recognize animals having standing in their own right.
Because I guess if animals don't have standing, then, well, number one, you can't sue. But this is why you have people, or why you have the argument that, well, people have to speak out because the animals can't speak. But now suddenly if you say the animals can speak for themselves because they have standing, that changes the equation totally.
That's right. That's right. And it's and it's a fundamental building block to creating and recognizing these other fundamental rights for animals. You know, we're not arguing for animals to have exactly the same rights as humans do. That's not the point. They shouldn't, because their interests are different than ours. But when it comes to the fundamental right to be left alone, to not be killed or abused or exploited for somebody else's benefit, and to just be able to live their lives as animals of their own species are concerned, it shouldn't be that difficult. We should be willing to extend to others the exact same rights and protections that we demand for ourselves.
But you're talking about the phrase comes up, appropriate rights, right? Because people would say, oh, animal rights, what a ridiculous notion, right? When they say everything for animals and the same as humans. What is this idea of appropriate rights?
Well, it's some of the things I just mentioned. The right to live their lives the way they want, the way they choose, not how humans choose as we exploit them. The right not to be beaten, the right not to be experimented on, the right not to be killed for food, or to anally or genitally electrocute a mink or a chinchilla, or catch a coyote in a leg hold trap so that we can have a bit of fur trim on a coat. These are fundamental rights. The right to be taken care of, to have appropriate food, to have appropriate shelter in some way other than just the very bare minimums that some of our laws now provide for.
But when animals get standing, boy, that will be the day, huh?
It really will be a game changer. And it's important to keep in mind here that when we're talking about animal rights, humans are animals too. We're all animals. We should all be entitled to those same fundamental rights that we hold so dear to ourselves. And it's a very straightforward, compassionate concept.
Jeff Kerr, PETA's top lawyer, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Emil. Thanks for having me.
PETA General Counsel Jeffrey Kerr. And that's our show. Contact us by visiting the website at PETA.org. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.